One that uproar with the shoulder sitter, the dructive march hath hersed to the ritter, and where that ever van and such recur, of which vertu engendered is the fur. When Zephyrus eke with his sweat to breath, and spirit hath in every hut and heath, the tender Acropus and the young Asunna hath in the ram his half-course runna, and smaller fool is making melody, that slippen o' the neck with open ear. So pricketh hem nature in her courages, than a longen folk to gun on pilgrimages.
This is the opening to the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, generally considered the first masterwork of English literature. But this isn't a channel on English lit. It's one on the history of astronomy. So why are we bringing up this text? As you probably expect, it's because the Canterbury Tales is full of astronomical references. In fact, you just heard one of them in the 7th line when Chaucer tells us that the young sun hath in the ram his half-course run. What Chaucer is telling us here is that the sun is halfway through Aries, the ram, placing the pilgrimage in early spring. Indeed, Chaucer later explicitly tells the reader that it is the 18th of April in the Man of Law's Prologue. References like these are important to scholars who have been attempting to answer a mystery at the heart of the Canterbury Tales. What order are the stories supposed to be in? In today's video, we'll discuss how scholars have attempted to answer this question by understanding what Chaucer knew about astronomy before the telescope. Before beginning, it's worth a reminder that astronomy in Chaucer's time was far more diverse than we tend to think of astronomy today. It included practical applications, the determination of time, setting of calendars, and navigation. It included the natural philosophy of the cosmos, exemplified by Aristotle and Plato, which described the fundamental nature of the medieval cosmos. It included astrology, the influence of the planets on the world as well as people. Lastly, it included the understanding of constellations, their positions, and mythologies. As we'll see, Chaucer's use of astronomy touches on most of these different forms, in a direct application of some, but also as metaphor and as a framework for the stories. This complicated layering of elements is part of what has allowed Chaucer's work to remain of interest to scholars for so long. Another reason scholars debate the work so much is that the Canterbury Tales is not actually a finished work. In the general prologue, the host who leads the pilgrims on the journey sets the challenge that each pilgrim should tell 2 tales on the journey to Canterbury Cathedral and 2 on the way back, with the best tale receiving a free meal. However, almost none of the pilgrims tell more than 1 tale. Worse yet, the Canterbury Tales contains 24 stories. But the order of these stories changes between manuscripts. There are some groups of stories that tend to be found together, which scholars refer to as fragments. Thus, scholars have attempted to sort through context clues for insight into Chaucer's authorial intent. This includes landmarks on the journey as well as astronomical events. To understand one of the ways that scholars have done this, let's take a look at the most direct application of astronomy, something scholars refer to as Chronographia. This simply means communicating the time through a situation as opposed to a direct statement of it. By telling us the position of the sun along the zodiac, Chaucer could indicate the date, as we've already seen. But before diving in further, let's dig into this one a little further, as there's already a serious problem that you may have caught if you were paying close attention. Specifically, we have to remember that when medieval astronomers give the position of the sun in a zodiac sign, they are generally not referring to the actual constellation. Rather, they're referring to sections of the ecliptic beginning at the vernal equinox and progressing in 30-degree segments. Because of the precession of the equinoxes, the signs have drifted with relation to the constellations they were based on. In Chaucer's time, the spring equinox had already drifted well into Pisces. Thus, when Chaucer tells us that the sun is halfway through the sign of Aries, we should take it to mean that the sun had an ecliptic longitude of 15 degrees. Since the sun moves along the ecliptic at just under 1 degree per day, we should expect this would mean that it is 15 days after the vernal equinox, which poses a large problem. In Chaucer's day, the vernal equinox took place around the 12th of March due to the Julian calendar slipping over the centuries. See my video on the Gregorian calendar for more information on that. But even without understanding any further, we can clearly see that 15 days after March 12th is not April 18th. Thus, the very first Chronographia we encounter is flawed. As such, Chaucer scholars seem to generally treat this one as more metaphorical. However, there's another way we could rescue this, which would be to instead interpret the solar position in reference to the actual constellation. In that case, the position of the sun on April 18th was, in fact, near the center of the constellation of Aries. We can't say for certain whether or not this was Chaucer's intent, as it would be a very unusual and inconsistent way of framing this. Regardless, there are other forms of chronographia in which Chaucer does exhibit a greater degree of precision. For example, the angle of the sun above the horizon on a specific date tells us the time. Thus, enough clues of this sort could establish a chronology of the story which might be used to help order the fragments. Another example of this comes from the introduction to the Man of Law's tale. In it, Chaucer explicitly tells us that it is the 18th day of April, and then tells us that the host
so well that the shadow of every tree was in length the same quantity. That was the body erect that caused it.
In other words, the length of the shadow of trees was the same as their height. Basic trig tells us that this happens when the sun is 45 degrees above the horizon. Chaucer tells us as much, and from this he determines it to be 10 o'clock in the morning. This is a strangely precise piece of information. So how would the host, and by extension, Chaucer, know such a thing? There are two possibilities. The first is that Chaucer used an astrolabe to determine this. This is certainly something that Chaucer knew how to do, as he has an entire work on the construction and use of an astrolabe, written for his son Lois. Let's take a quick look at how this was done. First, on the reverse of the astrolabe, there are two circles around the edge. The first one is the 360-degree circle of the zodiac, broken up into the 12 signs, with each sign being broken into 30 degrees. Just inside of this, there is a series of dates, with the beginning of Aries, the position of the sun on the vernal equinox, being aligned with the date of the equinox. To use it, we take the bit that rotates, known as the rule, and turn it to the date in question. Once aligned, it also points to the position of the sun in the zodiac on that date. We then flip the astrolabe over. On the cutout disc, known as the reedy, which represents the celestial sphere, there is a circle representing the zodiac. We find the solar position we just determined on it, and rotate it until it is the proper height above the horizon, 45 degrees in this case. This is determined by looking at the plate just under the reedy, which represents the local sky. Thus, this plate is only for a specific latitude, but most astrolabes included multiple plates that could be swapped out for different latitudes. This bold line indicates the horizon, and each of the circles up from there represents lines of altitude. So, in this case, we find the one corresponding to 45 degrees and rotate the reedy until the sun is at the right position. Once that is done, we use the rule on the front to point to this, and then read off the time on the circumference. It seems like magic, but an astrolabe is really just a sky simulator. The second way that Chaucer could have known is much simpler, by looking it up in a book. In Chaucer's time, many professional astronomers produced astronomical almanacs. In doing so, they would determine the dates of important holidays, calculate the position of various celestial objects throughout the year, predict eclipses, and use this information to make astrological predictions for the year. often regarding the weather. These were generally in the form of an ephemerides or a calendarium. We again know that Chaucer was familiar with these because he refers to two of them in his treatise on the Astrolabe, one by John Somer and another by Nicholas of Lynn. Copies of both of these have survived to present day and have received critical editions. So, we can again see how Chaucer may have arrived at this piece of information. In Nicholas of Lynn's Kalendarium, there is a section for April. Within it, there is a table that presents, for each hour of the day, the angle of the sun above the horizon and how long the shadow would be for a person 6 feet tall. If we find the row for the 18th of that month and the column for the 10th hour, we find that the sun should be exactly 45 degrees above the horizon, and that the length of such an individual shadow would similarly be 6 feet. But no matter which method Chaucer used to derive this information, we clearly know that the Miller's Tale is fairly early in the morning. However, this was never in any serious doubt, as this is part of the fragment that unquestionably comes first. So, can other Chronographia help us place other fragments in the journey? Unfortunately, there's just not enough of them, and in fact, they may confuse the matter even further. At the beginning of the Parson's prologue, we're presented with a similar solar observation. In this one, the host tells us that the sun has gotten so low that it is
not to my sector, degrees 29 as in hecta.
This, the host tells us, means that it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If we again look at the Kalendarium from Nicholas of Lynn, we find that at 4 o'clock on April 18th, the sun was 29 degrees and 11 minutes, or 29.18 degrees above the horizon. This seemingly contradicts the statement in the text, which describes it as not 29 degrees. Some scholars read this to mean that it is less than 29 degrees when it should be more than 29 degrees. If we take this reading then at 4 p.m., the sun would have been just less than 29 degrees on April 17th, a day before the pilgrims set out. However, to me, this passage can have a different reading. Since the sun is descending from its noontime high, we could take this to mean not yet 29 degrees, which would allow the value to make more sense. But even that reading presents another problem. This is because the fragment that contains the Parson's Tale also contains Chaucer's conclusion. Thus, this is clearly the end of the pilgrimage, and this reading places it on the same day it began, indicating the pilgrims have traveled some 60 miles on foot in something around 10 hours, as opposed to the 3-day journey it was often divided into. Scholars don't seem to have a convincing answer for this. Perhaps surprisingly, some scholars, such as Sigmund Eisner, prefer the reading that would have the pilgrims arriving on the 17th, as this would time the pilgrims' arrival at Canterbury Cathedral to happen on Good Friday, if it were to have occurred in 1394, as this was the only year in the second half of the 14th century on which Good Friday fell on this date. However, Eisner admits this is an unsubstantiated suggestion. Other scholars, such as V.A. Kolb, dismiss the notion that Chaucer was trying to be realistic with the amount of time the pilgrimage would have taken, stating, Chaucer's concern was to create the fiction of a chronology, not a realistic chronology per se. Regardless, this time that Chaucer presents does little to improve the order of things. A similar problem exists in the Squire's tale, in which, as he begins his tale, the Squire begins to get lost in his world building before catching himself and stating,
I will not tarry in you, for it is prime.
In other words, he says he'll get to the point because it is prime, which is 9 a.m. But because the fragment containing the Man of Law's tale we began this discussion with also contains the introduction, the fragment containing the Squire's tale must come later in the order, yet appears to be before the Man of Law's tale. It is possible that when the Squire was saying this, he meant it in the context of his story, although saying such would have done nothing to help listeners understand what he was saying. That being said, a bit later in the story, he mentions that it was noon, so taking the former as a chronology within the story at least fits. There's another problematic chronographia in the opening to the Parson's Tale, the final tale in the series. In it, we are told that Libra was ascending, meaning that it was on the horizon. At 4 p.m. on April 18th, the beginning of Libra is just crossing the horizon. As a reminder, when I say Libra, I don't actually mean the constellation of Libra, but the portion of the ecliptic with longitudes of 180 to 210 degrees. In the Greek era, around the BC-CE divide, the position of the vernal equinox was around the beginning of Aries, but after 1400 years of precession, it dragged the vernal equinox and thus the ecliptic coordinate system with it. Thus, the actual constellation on the horizon at that moment was the middle of Virgo. Regardless, understanding this distinction, Chaucer's point is correct. However, he also says that this point is the moon's exaltation. This is an odd choice of words, as exaltation has a distinct astrological connotation. Specifically, medieval astrology held that the sun, moon, and each of the planets had a zodiac sign in which they were the most powerful, known as their house or domicile. The sun and moon each get 1, Leo and Cancer respectively, and the planets each get 2. However, they also have specific points in the zodiac outside of their houses at which they are more powerful still. This is known as the exaltation. The moon's exaltation is 3 degrees into Taurus. This seemingly contradicts Chaucer's statement since he is claiming that the moon's exaltation is in Libra. As such, Mary Jane Osborne suggests that Chaucer may have been using exaltation to mean rising. Taking this reading at least allows the comment to make sense and would add one additional piece of information. For all of the years around the time that Chaucer composed the Canterbury Tales, the moon was only in this region of the sky in 1391 on this date. Prior to this, the moon wasn't in this zodiac sign since 1380 and wouldn't be again until 1399. But, as with Eisner, this is an unsubstantiated suggestion that smooths out the reading but has no further evidence behind it. Another Chronographia is presented in the Nun's Priest's Tale, but this one clearly exists within the context of the story the Nun's Priest is telling, and thus cannot be used to set the pilgrimage in order, although I'll return to that a bit later. But ultimately, it seems we will be unable to use Chronographia to determine the order of the fragments. However, Dr. Anne Astell believes that she is able to determine the order of the fragments using astronomy in a different manner. As mentioned, astronomy throughout the medieval period was grounded in natural philosophy, particularly that of Aristotle and Plato. However, natural philosophy continued to evolve throughout this period, and Neoplatonism was very influential during Chaucer's lifetime. In particular, Chaucer may have been inspired by the Neoplatonic writer Macrobius. In his commentary on the Dream of Scipio, he states that souls descend to Earth from the outer reaches of the celestial sphere. As a soul passes through each of the planetary spheres, it is imbued with certain qualities. In Saturn's sphere, it obtains reason, logistikon, and understanding, theoretikon. In Jupiter's sphere, it acquires power to act, practicon. From Mars's sphere, a bold spirit, thymikon. From the Sun, the perception of senses, aestheticon, and imagination, phantasticon. From Venus's sphere, it gains passion, epithemedicon. As it passes through Mercury's sphere, it gains the ability to speak and interpret language, hermeneuticon. From the Moon, it gains the ability to form a shape, phyticon. Astell believes that Chaucer was inspired by this progression of the soul, and that the various stories parallel this journey of the soul descending to Earth and then returning to heaven in reverse order. However, this is cleverly hidden, as Chaucer cloaks the planetary associations in subtle astrological references, as well as nods to the astronomical overtures in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, and other references and metaphors. Ultimately, she concludes that this order matches one particular manuscript of the Canterbury Tales, known as the Ellesmere manuscript, which she takes to be as the intended order. Her argument is laid out in her book, Chaucer in the Universe of Learning. Overall, I think her argument makes a compelling case for the early stories following this pattern, but in my opinion, it falls apart pretty quickly as the astronomical connections grow increasingly tenuous as the tales progress. I don't have time to go through every story in this video, but let's examine what I consider to be the most compelling astronomical connections early on to illustrate how Chaucer wove astronomy into his work. If we follow Astell's argument, the first tale, The Knight's Tale, should be Saturnian in nature. To understand how this might be so, allow me to briefly summarize the story. In it, two knights, Palamon and Achaidh, are captured in a battle by Theseus, the ruler of Athens. They are imprisoned in a tower in Athens and both see Emily, the sister-in-law of Theseus, from their window. Both fall for her and lament their imprisonment. Eventually, Achaidh is released on the condition that he never return to Athens. However, after being inspired by Mercury, Achaidh disobeys this and returns in disguise to pursue Emily. But, as he does, Palamon escapes and the two encounter each other, resulting in the challenge of a duel. At the same time, Theseus encounters them, but is moved by their love and agrees to hold a tournament, the victor of which will be wed to Emily. The tournament is held and the arena is fashioned in a large circle with gates at east and west. The east gate has a shrine to Venus, which is where Palamon enters. At the west, a temple to Mars, by which Achaidh enters. Each knight prayed to their respective god, Achaidh to Mars, asking to win the tournament, and Palamon to Venus, to be wed to Emily. On the northern side of the stadium, without a gate, there is a shrine to Diana, often associated with the moon. Ultimately, Palamon is defeated in the tournament by being dragged to the ground by 20 of Achaidh's men. Theseus calls a halt to the fighting to declare Achaidh the victor, but before he can, Achaidh's horse rears up, throwing him from the saddle and mortally wounding him, leaving Palamon to wed Emily. Thus was Mars's promise to Achaidh fulfilled, and Venus's to Palamon. So, where is Saturn in all of this? Saturn features explicitly at the apex of the tournament, where the specific gods to whom the shrines were dedicated are featured. There it is Saturn who resolves the paradox caused by the apparently conflicting promises that Venus and Mars have made, as it was Saturn who caused Achaidh's horse to rear. Thus, Saturn's role is the most prominent among all the gods present. This makes sense given that the more distant a planet was in the geocentric model, the stronger its influence was believed to be. Thus, Saturn allows Mars's promise to be completed before Venus's. But Saturnian elements are also woven in more subtly. Astrologically, Saturn is associated with melancholy, and the two knights, while imprisoned in the tower, both fall into this sadness as they pine for Emily. Furthermore, Saturn's path is the slowest, taking the longest to complete a cycle through the zodiac. Correspondingly, the Knight's Tale is the longest. The second tale is the Miller's Tale, which, according to Astell's hypothesis, should be Jovian in nature. To summarize this story quickly, Nicholas is a young astrologer who rents a room at the home of a carpenter named John, who has a beautiful young wife named Allison. Despite her being married, Nicholas woos Allison and concocts a plan to ensure that John is away so they can engage in an affair. Nicholas convinces John that the planets are predicting an imminent flood and that, to avoid this, they should hang tubs from the ceiling in the barn and stock them with provisions for them to spend the night in. This way, when the flood comes, they can cut the ropes and float away with the water. They make these preparations and, during the night, Nicholas and Allison slip away. As they are about to get down to it, another of Allison's wooers, Absalon, comes by and asks for a kiss. Instead, Nicholas sticks his rear end out of the window and, as Absalon kisses it, lets out a mighty fart. Absalon, furious, leaves to fetch a hot poker. Returning with it, he asks for another kiss. When Nicholas again sticks his derriere out the window, Absalon brands it with the iron, prompting Nicholas to call for water. John, hearing this, cuts his tub down and crashes to the floor. So, how does Jupiter relate to this tale? Astell's strongest argument here is that of Jupiter's nature, which is said to be hot and wet. Both heat, through the hot iron, and water, through the supposed flood, feature prominently in this story. Similarly, Jupiter was believed to embody the traits of wit, cheerfulness, and humor which certainly preside in this tale. However, Astell also makes some dubious claims, stating that Jupiter is associated with thunderstorms and floods. However, I'm not aware of any evidence supporting this claim. Indeed, William Lilly's Christian Astrology from 1647 states that Jupiter usually precedeth serenity, pleasant and healthful north winds, and by his gentle beams all eyes the ill weather of any former malignant planets. Furthermore, as we saw in my video on the flood panic of 1524, the flood was predicted due to a conjunction of Jupiter and the other planets in a watery sign. Thus, it's not the planets themselves that control the weather, but their presence in the various zodiac signs. This seems to significantly undercut the argument Astell makes. Following Jupiter, the next tale should be associated with the Martian elements. Here again, the primary association is astrological. The Reeve himself is described as choleric, which according to humorism is related to fire, which is hot and dry, the very characteristics of Mars. Following the Miller's Tale, which made a carpenter the target of mockery, the Reeve becomes irate, due to him having formerly been a carpenter. Anger is a Martian trait. However, Astell again seemingly invents other traits for Mars that I can't find any support for. In particular, she claims that those with Martian faults suffer from pride, especially in one's lineage, and fraudulence. The pride Astell describes is better associated with the sun. Again, citing Lily's Christian astrology, we are told that the solar man is arrogant and proud, disdaining all men, cracking of his pedigree. Deceit, according to Albumisar, is most closely associated with Mercury. So despite these traits appearing in the story, I disagree with Astell's assertion that they are Martian in nature. Overall, I find Astell's hypothesis interesting, but the astronomical evidence she cites often falls apart under scrutiny. As another example, Astell claims that the canon Xiaomen's tale to be solar because it involves alchemy, the purpose of which is to transmute gold, which is associated with the sun. But despite the explicit association of gold and the sun in the text, the tale is actually about transmuting silver, a lunar element. Thus, while Astell does bring up some interesting astronomical associations in the text, I recommend being skeptical. Ultimately, I don't find that there is a convincing astronomical argument to be made regarding an absolute chronology. However, this doesn't mean we can't appreciate the astronomical references within the text. And there are a few more worth mentioning. Another use of astronomy comes in the Franklin's Tale. In this story, a young man named Aurelius attempts to woo the married Dorigen, whose husband is overseas. She rejects him, but he becomes so despondent that Dorigen agrees to marry him if he can accomplish the impossible task of removing all the stones from the coast of Brittany. To achieve this, Aurelius turns to a magician, who is nothing more than an astronomer. Chaucer then inserts a long passage describing the calculations the astronomer performs. At a first reading, this might appear as a bit of mumbo-jumbo, meant to impress Aurelius and the reader. But scholars believe this may have been a far more impressive description of the astronomer-magician calculating the time at which a series of factors would produce an uncommonly high tide, thereby hiding the rocks on the coast and creating the illusion that an illusion had taken place. Specifically, the authors of that research suggest that there are 4 factors which can increase the tide. The spring tides, when the moon is either full or new. During eclipse seasons, when the moon is nearest the node and at the proper latitude. When the moon is closest to the Earth in its monthly orbit, perigee. And when the Earth is also at its closest approach to the Sun, perihelion. The authors calculated that this unique set of circumstances happened in 1340, which was likely the time around which Chaucer was born. However, they suggest that Chaucer may have had indirect knowledge of such a flood from his role overseeing construction of wharves in London's port, or as part of his role on a royal commission to oversee repairs to the walls and ditches on the Thames. While I find it plausible that Chaucer may have been inspired by an unusually high tide from 1340, I'm skeptical that he could have had his character attempting to calculate all of the factors just described, as I can't find any sources that reveal such a sophisticated understanding of tidal mechanics. Another clever use of astrology occurs in the Nun's Priest's Tale. This story, in short, is the tale of a rooster, Chaunticleer, who is tricked by a fox pretending he has come only to hear Chaunticleer sing. He then grabs Chaunticleer by the throat and runs off. The farmhands pursue him, but fail to catch him. To save himself, Chaunticleer tricks the fox in turn, telling him that he should shout mockery at his pursuers, allowing Chaunticleer to escape. Early in this story, Chaunticleer's astronomical prowess is described as it allowed him to know when to crow. Furthermore, the story tells us that it is 32 days past the end of March, marking the date within the story as the 3rd of May, on which the sun's position was 21 degrees into Taurus. The joke here has to do with medicinal astrology. This also comes up in the general prologue, in which we're introduced to the cast of characters. Among them is the Doctor, who, by our modern standards, has a rather odd set of qualifications. Specifically, we're told that he was educated in astronomy and was capable of calculating planetary positions. In Chaucer's time, the basis of medicinal thinking was grounded in humorism, in which diseases were caused by imbalances of the 4 humors: blood, yellow and black bile, and phlegm. These 4 humors were associated with the classical elements and were able to be influenced by the planets. Similarly, astrology also appears in medicine by associating various signs with specific parts of the body, and this explains the joke with Chaunticleer. The zodiac sign of the day is a bit of light foreshadowing, as Taurus happens to be the sign associated with the throat, which is what the fox grabs Chaunticleer by. Returning to the Knight's Tale, I'd like to mention one other beautiful astronomical element that Chaucer has woven into this tale. To understand, it's important to know that the tale Chaucer has the knight tell is not original to him. Rather, it comes from Boccaccio's Teseida, and there are some subtle changes. In Boccaccio's version of the tale, the orientation of the gates the knights enter for the tournament is switched. Additionally, Boccaccio places the tournament in late summer, but Chaucer has moved it to May. Lastly, Chaucer changes the order in which the prayers are made by each of the individuals. Boccaccio's version has Archaidh praying to Mars, followed by Palamon to Venus, and then Emily to Diana. Chaucer switches the order to be Palamon, Emily, and then Archaidh. These changes seem unimportant, but they allow the stadium to represent the zodiac in an important way. Returning to our understanding of the astrological houses, arranging the stadium in this manner in May would place the sun in Taurus, both the constellation and sign, which is one of the houses of Venus. The tournament began in the morning with the sun rising, which means that this sign would have been rising with it, in the east, where Venus's temple happened to be. Meanwhile, the end of Scorpius would be setting in the west, which happens to be one of Mars's houses, corresponding to Mars's temple, also in the west. To the south would be Aquarius, which is the domicile of Saturn, who, despite not having a shrine, is certainly present in the story. Lastly, to the north is Cancer, although hidden below the horizon, which is the domicile of the moon, represented by Diana, who has her temple in the north. Thus, this subtle change allows Chaucer to empower the shrines with astrological significance, underscoring the power the featured gods have in the tale, and aligning the entire cosmos with the duel about to unfold on Earth. Regarding the change to the order of the prayers, it's important to understand that, in addition to the planets being most powerful in certain signs, each hour of the day is ruled over by a cycle of the planets, again including the sun and moon. This is known as the planetary hours. Chaucer tells us that the tournament took place on a Monday and that Palamon prayed first to Venus 2 hours before dawn. Medieval timekeeping is complicated, but in one system, the day and night were each reckoned to have 12 hours, regardless of how long each actually was. This meant that in the summer, daytime hours were longer and nighttime hours were shorter. The reverse was true in winter. On the equinoxes, they were equal. This system is known as the unequal hours system, and the day was often reckoned to start with sunrise in this system. This aligns with the planetary hours in which each hour of the day is ruled over by a specific planet, again making that planet's influence more powerful. If we look at a list of which planet ruled over the hours, we can see that the 11th hour of night on a Sunday, when Palamon prayed to Venus, is indeed Venus's hour. Similarly, Emily prays to Diana the first hour after dawn on Monday, which is ruled over by the moon associated with Diana. Chaucer makes it even more clear that he is fully cognizant of these planetary hours by giving the time of Achaidh's prayer to Mars as the next hour of Mars following Emily's prayer. Thus, we see that Chaucer layers on yet another astrological reference, with each party invoking their respective planet when they are the most powerful. So, to review what we've learned, Chaucer wove astronomy throughout many of the Canterbury Tales. This was often done in the form of using astronomy to tell the time or date. He may have done this through use of an astrolabe, as he was certainly practiced with one, but he may have also gotten some information from astronomical handbooks. He also was clearly familiar with astrology and wove it through the tales to give greater cosmic significance to the scenes and characters. Interestingly, the fact that Chaucer did this may give us a hint at his intended audience. While most authors were writing to appeal to potential wealthy patrons, that is not necessarily the class that would most appreciate the astronomical references. Rather, his clerky peers may have been better suited to understand these references. Indeed, the two earliest known owners of a copy of the Canterbury Tales were Richard Sutherworth and John Stoppenden, who were both chancery clerks with possible ties to Thomas Chaucer, William's son, through Thomas Hasseley. But regardless of the intended audience, the Canterbury Tales subtly weaves astronomy into them, adding an additional artful layer. This complicated layering of elements is what has kept scholars debating Chaucer's work for so many centuries. Hi everyone, thanks for watching. If you want to know even more about what Chaucer knew about astronomy before the telescope, consider subscribing to my Patreon. There, you'll find the script for this video with an additional 30 pages of notes, as well as all the sources I used. But if that's more than you want, thanks for watching anyway, and I'll see you next time on Astronomy Before the Telescope.